Hello, we are back for our third and final installment of Writing for Healing with writer and mom Faith Wilcox. Faith is the mother of two daughters. Her younger daughter, Elizabeth, died of a rare bone cancer. And during that time and after, Faith's writing proved to be a tool and vehicle for healing that she now shares the practice with other families, other parents and patients who are living with serious illness. Just to reiterate why we're doing this, Courageous Parents Network believes that everyone has a story to tell, and that those stories can help others, parents to parents, physician to physician, physician to parent, and parent to physician. We love to hear other people's stories. In them, we find ourselves and feel that we are not alone, and we also can learn from others based on how it is they think and how it is they make sense of the world. So, to encourage our network to start writing and explore their stories, we will be posting monthly writing prompts. So can you give us some examples of writing prompts?
Sure, of course. There are many. One that's kind of fun to do is to just say to yourself, just write, where you put your pen down on the paper and you don't lift your pen off the paper. And I have been so surprised where I've gone when I've done this. Sometimes you have to say just write 25 times or just write it down 25 times, but then your imagination will take over after that. You can also work with your senses. So you can you could listen to a piece of music while you're writing or before you're writing. You can focus on what you hear. You could go outside and you could listen to birds, cars, whatever it is in your environment. As I mentioned, you could meditate. It's also sometimes, it's good to remember, like, where were you? Let's say when you're in a difficult circumstance, or who was with you. And that time you can focus on how you feel, if you feel ready to do this. And then you can think sometimes about your wishes, like, if I could be anywhere right now, where would I like to be? Or if you could be with anyone now, who would that person be? Try to work at expressing yourself freely, like what delights you. Mm-hmm. And can you link these feelings to where you are in your life? Another one that's kind of fun is to write without knowing what's going to be next. You might surprise yourself with what comes out. I've also sometimes take quotes from authors or musical artists. So here are a couple. Be Yourself, Everyone Else is Taken by Oscar Wilde. Courage is Found in Unlikely Places by J.R. Tolkien. Or here's another one. I've been searching for ways to heal myself and found that kindness is the best way. Lady Gaga. So there are just many different avenues, and the more you can think about different avenues, I think the freer your writing will be.
So I really appreciate that, and I can sort of, my own firsthand experience with this is very recent, which is I had listened to a podcast interview with the writer and teacher Ross Gay, who wrote the Book of Delights, which I've ordered. I don't have that book and I can't wait to read it. But he, for 365 days, he wrote every single day about something that delighted him. And he would look for little things, so it was like a cup of yogurt brought him delight. And in the interview that I heard, he gave some examples, and he read the word loitering. He elaborates on how the word loiter delighted him, and so he explores that, and he was off and running. So in this time, I was like, okay, I have time and I'm looking to process a bunch of things. So I will try to write not ambitious for a year, I will try to write for 30 days. and I needed to set the bar very low. I'm on day 9 of 30, just for the record. I had to set the bar really low. So I decided to write about I have decided to write about an object in my house. I have to write about 30 different objects in my house. And every day I have to find a different object and write about it. And that is not intimidating. Like, this is a thing. It's just a thing.
Right, right.
But the thing, so the invitation is not intimidating. But interestingly, the thing has all these associations, and they just sort of dribble out as I write about it. And I'll be interested to see when it's over, to see what this thing looks like. And it's just for me, but it's working, and it's just an object in my house.
Right. Oh, that sounds like a really great idea.
Something pretty low bar that's evocative. And to your point, the prompts can be pretty simple. All right. So what comes after our writers, the writers have gotten those initial thoughts on the paper?
Well, there are a number of stages that go on in the writing process, and you might not realize this until you go back and you read your writings sometimes many years later. The first phase, often one might write with a very raw honesty, just really very direct. And if it is tied around a trauma, it might actually be short phrases. It may not be complete sentences or complete paragraphs. You're just really trying to pour it all out of yourself so it doesn't stay trapped inside. And then there's another phase which is reflective, and you go back and you read over some or all that you have written, and it can be very reinforcing because it can help you realize, oh my gosh, I've gone over so many hurdles so far, and I've traveled such a long way, and that recognition can be reinforcing for you. And the last phase, it's referred to as the quest phase, but that's where you've accepted what has happened in your life, and you have really you're at a place of a new normal for you. And often in this phase, you will have gained a new understanding about all that you've gone through. And it can happen in time that you've learned some lessons from your experiences that you've had.
Can you give an example, not yet in your writing, but reflect on a moment where what it felt like for you, Faith, to read something you'd written, and in reading it, see what was going on there and see who you were and how reflecting, seeing yourself then, now, and the reflecting that comes during that phase helped you shape your understanding?
I have, especially when I go back and I look at what I've written early on, and I realize when my daughter was first diagnosed, how much that I had to face early on, and how things were, diagnoses, timetables, just a whole upheaval of my life in terms of spending all this time in the hospital versus being home. And it made me appreciate, really, I was sort of in a tsunami. It made me appreciate that more, because sometimes you could say to yourself, gosh, could I have done more at some point? And when you realize that, or I realized that, no, I probably couldn't have. I was swimming as fast as I could. That in some ways, that's sort of comforting to know that you did the best you could at that particularly very, very difficult stage.
And do you think that is that part of the healing process, maybe to revisit it, but now that you're in a different phase and you're reflecting on it, it allows you to sort of hold the person that you were and acknowledge the person that did that, and then sort of, validate who you were and what you did in order to move forward?
I think that's very true. You have to sort of take care of that person who you once were. Mm-hmm. And I believe because there's so much going on when you have a child who is ill, you can't really remember everything. You just can't. It's just not possible. So with writing, you can go back and you can look and you can say, wow, this was a lot to experience. And as you say, you can try to take care of that person who you once were. And many of us were young. I mean, really quite young when we went through all this, and our life experiences were quite limited up to that point.
Yeah, that is such a good point. We're not born equipped to do this. So these are things that we're figuring out as we go. And it's easier to have compassion for ourselves after the fact than when we're in it. And as you said, in the tsunami, and can't even have the perspective about what's going on because we're in it. So Faith, let's now, if you would please give us an example from your own experience on how reflecting on your writing led to an evolution in a piece.
Of course. What I'll talk to you about is when I was going to go on a silent retreat, which was several months after my child died. And I had first, if you want to call it, it's called the chaotic phase, when I was just writing sort of in phrases and my thoughts were not necessarily connected. They were just popping out at me. A retreat sounds just like what I need. I need to be quiet, sleep, and grieve. I've lost the feeling of being at peace with myself during the past many, many months. I'm fractured, and so is my family. My family shattered from 4 to 2 almost overnight. So if family is the most important core of my life, my central core, now who am I after the death of my youngest child and my divorce? Do I have the possibility of healing? I'm not sure that I do. So again, that's an example of thoughts sort of randomly coming out at me, and I'm just writing them down. I'm not editing them. I'm not going back. I'm not saying, oh, maybe I shouldn't say that now. It's just really, really important just to express what you're feeling. So when I'm on my silent retreat, I can already tell by the tone of my writing and by what I've selected to write about, I'm in a calmer phase. And writing for me is often tied to nature. I draw a lot of metaphors with the natural world, and that's taking a walk, for example, being by a river, being by the sea is very calming for me, and that comes through in my writing. So this is a next stage when I'm being more reflective and I'm just calmer in my outcome. The clouds are lavender now with sweeps of rose. It's so calm by the edge of the tidal river. Instead of picking up shells like I love to do on the beach, I pick up stones, twisted and weathered branches, and birch bark in splendid shapes. I burn them in my wood stove at night. In this familiar New England landscape, so quiet except for the caw of the blue jay and the sharp notes of the cardinal, I feel at peace. Again, I think it just comes through my writing that I was feeling much calmer and much more at peace. Then many, many years later, I wrote a poem looking back on my experiences there. And in this phase, what is referred to often as the quest phase, I'm making some meaning out of the experience that I had gone through while I was on a retreat. I remember a time by a tidal river. I walked along the banks, picked up birch bark and fallen golden leaves. I was lost. I was devastated. I almost could not breathe after the death of my youngest child. I retreated to a monastery by a river. All that I could manage was to eat and sleep, walk and weep. I had no communication with the outside world, but I was not alone. I felt God's presence as I walked in the woods, as I wrote on a simple wooden desk, and as I sat by a fire at night. The river flowed back to the sea, the golden leaves fell, the fields were hayed, the birch bark ignited into hot flames. I was living a moment in the eternal, no beginning, no ending. Part of the river, part of the fields, part of the fire. I began not to fight the rhythms of life and to realize that I, a loving mother, and my children are part of this rhythm. The rivers are drawn to the sea. They always have been.
It's beautiful.
Thank you.
What has it been like for you? You have had one book of your poetry published, and you have a memoir coming. What is it like for you to see that? And I imagine that when you see, there is a connection between that work that you have created and Elizabeth. How do you think of those two things?
There absolutely are connections. And when I first saw my book of poetry, I just felt just overwhelmed in a very, very positive way, because I honestly thought I've captured a lot of Elizabeth, who she is in this book, and I've captured also what it's like to be a young mother and to go through these different phases. And the whole experience for me was just very, very positive. So I think whether one writes in your journal and keeps it private, or whether someday you might want to publish through self-publishing, whatever works for an individual, but there is something to be said for seeing your work in a body drawn together. I wrote poetry first because that was just a natural way for me to, especially to draw so many metaphors that I do with the natural world. And then years later, literally like 15 years later, I started writing prose. That grew into the book that I will have out shortly.
And has your older daughter read your poetry?
Yes, she's read my poetry. She has.
And does it prompt conversations with her? Does she ask you about it in terms of where it came from and what was going on then? Does that come up?
Sometimes she does. Sometimes she does. You know, many times she experienced a lot of what I did. And then also, being a sibling is a very different experience. I imagine if she would write her poetry, if she were to write poems, we'd have some overlap, and then we'd have a whole nother perspective of hers.
Yeah. We do want to talk. We're going to have a conversation with a sibling about writing as a way of processing for siblings, not just for parents and caregivers. All right. Well, Faith, thank you so much for sharing that and for talking, and more to follow, and be very, very well.
Thank you. I will. And thank you for including me.